Okay, let's see how the plan announced by the government today clears a path eventually to get the pipeline expansion built, as promised by this government. Amarjeet Sohi is Canada's Minister of Natural Resources. He is with me now in our studio. Good to see you again, Mr. Minister. Thanks for coming in to speak with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Let's be clear on what's been announced today. And I want to start with the term meaningful consultations, because it came up a lot today at your news conference with Indigenous groups, meaningful consultations with Indigenous groups. You've already said numerous times, as has the Prime Minister, this pipeline expansion will get built. So what's the purpose of the meaningful consultations? What are you trying to find out if the ultimate end game for this project is it's going to get built over the objections of people who don't want it built?
Peter, when you look at the ruling from the federal court, court has identified two deficiencies. One is that when the review started in 2012, the impact of marine shipping should have been considered on the marine environment as well as on southern resident killer whales. That omission was made by a previous government. We are correcting that by directing the NEB to scope in the marine shipping and understand the impact of that on the marine environment, and they're going to report back to us in 22 weeks.
Great.
The second deficiency that court has identified is that even though we put in a very sound framework for consultation, that we engaged in good faith, but we failed to properly execute that. And so what I'm tasked with, what I have announced today, is that we're going to restart that phase 3 consultation, and we're going to redo that by adding more resources to the team, and by having proper mandate for the team to actually negotiate. What is meaningful consultation means, Peter, is that the people who are negotiating on behalf of the government should have the ability and empowerment to engage in a two-way dialogue, where they're listening to the concerns and offering accommodations where accommodation is possible to be offered.
Okay,
and that's exactly what we have empowered our team to do so as we restart the renegotiation.
Bunch of questions here. What's the timeline? How long are you prepared to have this consultation process go before? I mean, the whole purpose of the government taking over the project was to provide certainty to make sure it would get built. So give us some certainty. How long is the process going to last?
So the previous consultation took 7 months to complete, the phase 3 consultation. We are not starting from the scratch. We have a lot of information that was gathered during the previous consultation. We have heard a lot of concerns in the previous consultation, and court has given us a blueprint on which to move forward.
So less than 7 months?
Well, I'm not going to presuppose and put a timeline on consultations, because we want to engage in good faith, but the court has said that meaningful consultation can be undertaken in a focused and efficient manner. So what are we going to do? Engage in meaningful dialogue and offer accommodation when it's possible to do so, and make sure that we're engaging with all 117 Indigenous communities, seeking their input into how we engage with them with a proper mandate.
But you've told us you're not starting at scratch, and starting from scratch took 7 months. So if you're not starting from scratch, it should be reasonable for us to assume you want this done in less than 7 months.
We want to get it done the right way, which means following proper procedures, which means following the proper engagement and engaging in a way that Indigenous communities feel that they have been heard. And they have been heard and accommodation offered. And in cases where accommodation is not possible, they should know why accommodation is not possible. We are not working towards seeking unanimous support or building consensus, because consensus is not possible sometimes, but we will strive toward that. And that's exactly I'm going to do, and that's exactly what our team is going to do.
Are you prepared to change the project based on what you hear? For instance, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations had said, look, you might solve some of the pushback if you put the terminal for the pipeline at Tawasin, where the ferry terminal is now, instead of Burrard Inlet. Is that something you'd consider?
I think I do not want to make the same mistakes that were made under the previous consultation, which is presupposing the outcome of those consultations. We're going to listen carefully. There are very diverse opinions among Indigenous leaders on this pipeline and overall resource development, but our focus is making sure that we are building a strong economy, that we are building non-US export markets and getting our resources to those markets in a responsible, sustainable way so we can continue to create thousands of jobs that Canadians deserve.
Let me put
but we can
something-
only, this project such as this can only move forward when we get the environment right, when we get the Indigenous consultation
Let me
right.
put something before you. That's there are media reports today suggesting the government's been in discussions with First Nations groups to have the government give the pipeline over to First Nations groups, and that revenues that they might raise by running this pipeline would fund First Nations projects. What do you know about that?
You know, I have been engaging with Indigenous peoples even before appointment to this position, and I have doubled my efforts since being made minister by the Prime Minister of Natural Resources, right? And I have heard different views. Some Indigenous communities are interested in equity stake, some are not, and so Minister Morneau is responsible for engaging in those.
So you're not, the government's not saying no to that. Is there a scenario where the government, look, the government spends a lot of money on programs for First Nations, so to some people this would make sense. Let's, we have the pipeline, let's develop the project, let's hand it over to First Nations groups, and then there's a revenue source for decades to come. Is that something, you're not saying no to that?
What I'm saying is that we're going to listen very carefully, and we're going to understand what concerns they tell us, and then we're going to look at what accommodations we can offer. And Minister Morneau, who is responsible for the transaction from Kinder Morgan over to the government, has heard that from different stakeholders, including Indigenous peoples and stakeholders, they're interested in having ownership in this project, as they have done in a number of other resource projects.
We're going to hear in a moment from Grand Chief Stuart Phillip in BC, who says doesn't like the process, but he opposes the construction of this project to begin with, and at all costs. So he says he's ready to take you to court. After this process, whatever this process is, you'll be back in court with fighting Chief Phillip. What do you say to that? Are we in for a whole bunch more court cases on this?
No. What my responsibility is, Peter, what government's responsibility is, that we engage with all Indigenous leaders and communities impacted by this project in a meaningful, faithful way, and that's exactly what I am going to do. And we're going to listen to diverse views and different opinions and find the best path forward on this project. And we also appreciate there are Indigenous leaders who may not agree with us on this, and we respect that, and we're going to find as much possible to accommodate the concerns, but that meaningful consultation has to take place first before we make any decision.
All right, Minister of Natural Resources Amarjeet Sohi, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you so much for having me.